Episode 5, The Siege of Sol. They came as a weatherfront of light. Thousands of crystalline hulls sweeping inward from the black beyond Neptune, the last silent arc before thunder. Long before their lances touched steel, the solar system felt the pressure of their approach, sensor constellations saturating, relay nodes blanching under signal glare, the outer patrols reporting not ships, but a horizon. The Accord answered with the only language it had left. Bulwarks around Earth brightened into a lattice of overlapping shields. Ironclads rolled from their berths like continents remembering motion. Aegis and Hammerfall squadrons soaked their paint in silence and accelerated into positions that existed first as equations and then as vows. Mars, scorched and rebuilt, steadied its breath. The first wave was reconnaissance by force, the second an attempt to pry doctrine apart, the third a probe made of knives. Humanity bled for each lesson and learned quickly enough not to die of them. But the fourth wave did not behave like a wave. It behaved like the ocean. Carriers split the night and spilled drones in glittering pores. Cruisers arranged themselves on facets of geometry only they could fully see. Command vessels burned with a cold, interior fire that did not waver under counterstroke. The sky between Mars and the Belt turned into a kiln. Screens of Aegis frigates met the pressure and abraded it. They died as they had been taught to die, usefully, laying down fogs of chaff and heat mirage, snapping open jammers tuned to enemy targeting frequencies that changed every hour, then changing with them. Hammerfall packs dove through those momentary thickenings of space to stitch torpedo fans across funnels the Elythians had believed were theirs. Ironclads held in patient arcs, their rails lifting and falling in the ancient rhythm of work, shield planes slanting and re-slanting to deflect impossible lances into survivable angles. The line bent and bent again. It held because bulwarks were not walls, but organs. Power moved between them, along invisible tendons. When one dimmed, two others thickened their fields and gave it time to breathe. It held because ironclads accepted force without asking permission to fail. It held because hundreds of small ships agreed to the same sentence at once. And still, it began to break. The gap did not look like a gap. It looked like slight disorder where order had been perfect. An Aegis storm thinner by a dozen hulls, a Hammerfall pack arriving 15 seconds late because a pilot chose to finish a burst instead of turn with doctrine. The Elythian formation moved there with a confidence that had the weight of old habit. Their lances painted the dark. The first bulwark in that sector lost half its shield on a single breath. A second flared to cover and took the rest of the breath for it. The Eclipse had been waiting by design and by necessity. Since Hades, its commanders had learned that ore has a recharge time. Its lance could split a cruiser to atoms, but cooling cycles and field stabilization were physics that no vote could overrule. The Titan paced the battle like a held word, its presence changing the meaning of every sentence without yet being spoken. Each request for fire came up the lattice and was denied. Not here, not now, wait for the predicate. When the gap widened from suggestion to threat, the predicate arrived. The order that left the Eclipse traveled along 10 redundant paths and arrived at every hull that needed it as a single certainty. Open the seam wider. The Aegis screen in that sector thinned again, this time on purpose. Hammerfalls peeled away from safer lanes and made themselves obvious on the wrong vectors. One ironclad rotated out of the anchor and drifted 5 ship lengths too far in a movement so small only an enemy that measured pride in decimals would notice. The Elythians noticed. They stiffened their line and punched. The first lance that found the Ironclad's newly exposed plane did not pierce. It shoved. It shoved the cruiser exactly into a cross of shielding the bulwarks had just reshaped to be a sling. The Ironclad slid along it, bruised but alive, and the cross became a V, and the V became a funnel that drank enemy fire and spit it where it would do the least harm. Hammerfalls dove into the wake of that shove, launching spall-etched slugs designed not to bore holes, but to bloom shrapnel inside crystalline lattices that hated randomness. Escorts on the Elythian flank lost the elegance of their vectors and corrected. The correction opened a sight line. The Eclipse spoke. There is no metaphor that improves on the beam itself. It was a column of decision. A command ship at the heart of the Elythian formation ceased to be a shape and became a memory of brightness. And then, not even that. Space rang. Sensor ghosts, capacitors singing down the charge, the human lattice adjusting across 1,000 consoles to a reality with one fewer impossibility inside it. The enemy did not stop. The ocean does not end because a cliff falls into it. But the surface changed. Patterns rippled. The command mesh that had looked like inevitability suddenly looked like labor. The Eclipse took that labor as permission for a second sentence. It fired again, not at the most massive target, but at a smaller hull that rode the formation like punctuation. When it vanished, the cadence of the Elythian advance stumbled. Railfire from 3 ironclads landed on a third ship whose shields had been timed to a rhythm that no longer existed. The third ship died by arithmetic. The price of speaking was exacted at once. The Eclipse's forward shields fell 2 planes, then a third. Temperature warnings cascaded through decks as systems dumped heat into banks already sweating light. A bulwark 3,000 kilometers distant bled down its reserve into a tight beam transfer, fattening the flagship's shield just long enough for a lance that might have caught it to skid along an edge instead. Crew on the bulwark's capacitor levels slumped where they stood, air shimmering with the last of their safety margins. The transfer line went dark, and the bulwark dimmed with it. Another bulwark swallowed its burden and hummed, low and furious. The Elythians understood now where the hinge was. They poured toward it, lances converging into a white geometry that meant to separate the Eclipse from the rest of the sentence. The flagship refused solitude. It pulled the lattice closer, ironclads creeping in like tectonics, hammerfalls looping to cut the throats of drones that aimed to block shield ties, Aegis clouds thickening back into foam. For 10 minutes, that lasted a generation. The Eclipse absorbed what should have ended it. For 9 of those minutes, it did not fire. The 10th minute was all nouns. 3 shots in 27 seconds. No doctrine had written that burst. No cooling curve allowed it. The first tore a hole where enemy coordination had been tightest. The second carved a wedge through the wedge that answered, turning a spearhead into filings. The third did what the war had not yet seen. It lanced not a ship, but the seam between 2 shields at the exact instant they attempted to hand off load. The handoff failed. Both fields collapsed long enough for ironclad rails to move matter where nothing should have fit. In the tearing silence afterward, the Elythians blinked. Not an eye, but the momentary absence of certainty. The cost of defying curves is paid in heat. The Eclipse's radiators were already flaring at the color of pain. Now they shuddered. One of the forward shield projectors left its mount and became a piece of interior weather. 2 decks went to vacuum and stayed there. The flagship's main bus coughed, caught, and held because everything that had not already sacrificed itself for the chance of holding it had been designed to break in the least bad way. There are kinds of resilience that do not look like strength until the moment when the bill arrives and they still have something left in the pocket. Mars did not fall. The bulwarks around it dimmed to embers and brightened again on a schedule that insulted safety. Earth did not burn. The screen that wrapped it, the work of a decade compressed into months, compressed into these hours, shimmered and held. The gap that had threatened to become a wound became a scar, and then slowly, a seam. The Elythians tried once more to transform disbelief into annihilation. They gathered their carriers into a crescent and poured drones not at the line, but over it, aiming for the cold math of civilian orbits where victory would be counted in futures erased. The Accord rewrote its formation on the move. Aegis swarms inverted, climbing to meet a sky they had not planned to defend. Hammerfalls shed the last of their caution and broke into splinters, each splinter tasked with removing one precise tooth from the drone machine. Ironclads opened their hangars and vomited repair craft that latched onto wounded frigates like barnacles that gave back blood. Bulwarks retuned their grids to die more slowly. The Eclipse, its lance silent now, became a magnet for hatred and took it, grinding forward on shield planes that trembled at the edge of meaning. Then the thing no one had dared to program became necessary. Earth's bulwarks offered the Eclipse not just supplemental power, but phase discipline, timing, shape, the exact dance of a field meant to stand in front of everything a world is. For a minute, that could not be longer, the flagship wore a sheath, built from the timing of a planet. Enemy lancers that had learned the flagship's flutter found instead the steadiness of a home. The sheath cost 2 bulwarks their lives. It bought the Eclipse a crossing. On the other side of that crossing waited the largest of the enemy's command hulls, the fulcrum of a formation that still refused to break. The Eclipse did not have a fourth shot. It had something else, the capacity to make space where none existed. It rammed, not steel on steel, but fields on fields, the crushing interlock of volumes forced together until one agreed to be smaller. The flagship's remaining rail batteries spoke into that forced proximity. On the far side, a Hammerfall squadron that had spent itself and should have been gone realized there was exactly one more burn left in the tanks and made it. They vanished under the enemy's skin and left a gift of expanding metal behind. The command hull shivered, then folded like math around a wrong assumption. The ocean became water again. It did not withdraw in panic. It pulled back on lines so perfectly rehearsed that they were beautiful. But they were lines of leaving, not lines of eating, and that is a difference the body knows. Where they went, human ships did not chase. The lattice tightened, counted hulls, took bearings, and began triage that would last for days. When the light changed from war to wreckage, Sul remained. Mars hung in its red skin, pitted and breathing. Earth turned like a thought that had not been erased. Bulwarks flickered, some dark forever, some stubbornly alive. Ironclads drifted like black cliffs. Aegis pilots recited the names that had not answered and then slept inside their suits because there was nowhere else to go. Hammerfalls came home in fractions and were tallied by their fractions because fractions would be ships again if given time. The Eclipse floated in the high dark, a wound the size of a city glowing along its starboard flank, its lance assembly cooling with the quiet of something that has spent beyond wisdom and found that it could still pay. What made the difference was not only the beam, It was that the beam belonged to a grammar the civilization had learned to speak. The flagship turned physics into sentences the rest of the fleet could read. It absorbed attention so others could live long enough to matter. It showed the enemy that the center of human resolve was not a point to be punctured, but a volume made of ties. It survived because everything around it chose, again and again, to be part of the same decision. In the days that followed, the Accord did not proclaim victory. It published numbers, and the numbers hurt. But threaded through the hurt was a new constant. Sul had been sieged and had not fallen. The Elythians had come as certainty and left as work to be finished. The Eclipse slept under scaffolds, while welders stitched daylight back into its bones. Children drew its shape on the sides of ration bins. Priests blessed the burned metal and called it clean. Philosophers wrote one sentence and stopped. We are not what we were, and we are not done. The ocean would return. It always does. But now there was a shore that remembered how to stand, and a hammer that knew when to be used, and a people that had learned the difference between awe and discipline. When the Elythians came again, they would find not a miracle waiting, but a civilization. The siege ended not with a cheer, but with a reckoning. Sul remained, but it was no longer the Sul of memory. Mars bore scars that would never close. Cities shattered under the rain of lances, planes carved into glass by orbital strikes. Earth's skies were darkened with debris, a halo of wreckage from bulwarks and frigates that had burned themselves to hold the line. The asteroid belt, once a lattice of commerce, had become a graveyard of twisted hulls. Everywhere, silence, not peace, but the stunned quiet of survival. Families searched lists broadcast across every channel, finding absence where names should have been. Colonies mourned in ration lines, their grief measured in the same economy as food and power. Yet woven through the sorrow was something stronger: endurance. Humanity had not fallen. Against the ocean of Elythian might, the Accord had endured. The Eclipse, crippled but alive, became the axis of a new mythology. Workers climbed over its burned armor, like monks tending a cathedral, patching holes the size of cities with fragments of lost frigates. To touch its hull was to feel both death and survival, to know that humanity had spent everything and somehow found more. Where once it had been a weapon, now it was a monument, proof that even gods of war could bleed and still rise. In the chambers of the Terran Accord, the old language of survival was abandoned. The Council declared that humanity was no longer simply enduring, no longer resisting. It was transforming. The siege had been more than a battle. It had been a furnace. From it, the civilization that emerged was harder, sharper, stripped of illusions. Utopia was ash. What remained was iron. And so, in speeches carved not for beauty, but for clarity, the Accord named the age to come, the birth of iron, a new civilization forged from fire, prepared not only to resist, but to wage a war that would stretch beyond soul, beyond memory, beyond despair. The Elythians had not been defeated. They would return, and when they did, the cost would rise again. But the galaxy had witnessed something it had not believed possible. Humanity had faced annihilation at its heart and endured. Alone, abandoned, betrayed, it had held the cradle. The ocean would rise again. But now, the shore was steel. And across the scarred solar system, billions of voices whispered the same vow. This was only the beginning.